of you who are watching, but for those of you who are joining for the first time, I am an internationally accredited journalist, including accreditation to the Holy See as the Rome correspondent for the Epoch Times. You may also find me on Catholic World Report, and I've contributed to National Catholic Register, among other Catholic outlets. I hold a BA in history from Christendom College and a master's degree in foreign policy and diplomacy from the prestigious Norwich University. And as I said earlier, I am joined by my new co-host, new to you perhaps, but not to me, Colonel Matthew Dooley. Thank you for joining the show. And this is not a far cry from our last one a few years back called Power and Patriots with our friend Buzz Patterson. So, Matt, can you tell the audience for the first time who are listening to you who you are and how we know one another?
Yeah, Bree. Thanks for having me first. My name is Matt Dooley. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel. I spent 21 and a half years serving our country as an Army. I graduated from West Point in 1994, and spent most of my time as a maneuver officer. So for those who don't understand much about the U.S. Army, the armored and cavalry force is the mounted arm of decision. But that doesn't mean you spend all your time on tanks. I had quite a bit of time deployed doing peace enforcement, peacekeeping, as well as some operational deployments in support of operations in Iraq. My last assignments were in a portion of the Army that folks don't know exists. There is a significant element that spends its time developing new equipment, new tactics, new doctrine, and builds the Army after next. And so I spent the last few years of my service working on integrating robotics and autonomous systems into the force. And so I spend most of my time now helping advanced technologies find their way into helping us do things better, getting soldiers out of the dull, dirty, dangerous, and mundane tasks so the machines can do what they do best and humans can do what they do best. A lot of what I do touches on politics and current events.
Right.
You cannot spend your time divorced from that, understanding who our near-peer competitors are. And so I have some perspectives on that you saw during Powers and Patriots.
Yes. And so, Matt, when we deal with intersections, what we try to do here is to do crossing faith, culture, and current events news perspectives. And you and I are both Catholics. We both have come into the Catholic Church a little bit later in life. I was raised Catholic, but kind of in the nominal sense, and so I kind of had to find my way back. And I know that you also did the same. And for those of us who have come into the church during this pivotal time, I think many people see this current situation in the church as warfare. And I think you and I come with an interesting perspective in many different ways, both having fought in the war, one of the longest wars in our nation's history, and you prior to that having served in Kosovo and others. I think that our understanding of how information is presented, how news is presented, how to navigate that while we're looking at current events and knowing our enemies, knowing our allies, knowing what the purpose is, it will bring a perspective, I think, to a lot of people who are listening today or watching this. It'll bring a perspective that I don't think many people really have unless you've served. We're proud of our service, but, this comes at a cost. Right. And so in this sense, in our show today, what we are going to be doing is I always start out with giving a little bit of news of the church for the week. And then from there, we go on to, talking about news in the larger sense of the word in the world. And there's a lot of that today. So Matt, so I'm going to break down real quick some of the news from the church and maybe get your perspective on things from over in Virginia. Matt is in Virginia. I'm in Rome, so we're about 6 hours difference. So he's just waking up in the morning or just starting his day, and I'm midway through. But what I did hear this morning is that Pope Francis is set to resume his general audiences. This will be the first week, this Wednesday, that he will do a general audience since he's had that major surgery, right? And we still don't really know what the cause and the reason behind him having to have a large portion of his bowel removed. But we do know that he has been in recovery. And this has been the perfect time for it because we're entering the kind of the season of, vacations for Italians. For those of the Italians who can't really afford the Ferragosto prices or the August 15th prices, and it's that actually Ferragosto comes from Augustus Caesar. So vacation time started in Italy really back during the time of Caesar, and for those of you who are listening for the first time, Matthew Dooley is also a resident historian. He can speak to all things history. So we're going to talk a little bit about Ferragosto in a second. But many people have already gone out of Rome and out of Italy for July, right? So this will be the first general audience. He canceled it for his recovery time, and it's unfortunately going to be in a place that I really kind of despise, just for the architecture's sake. It's the Paul VI Hall that was announced today. So we're going to be having to go to this hall that's got a lot of modern stuff. It's definitely not the same as going into the courtyard of the Papal Palace. But we will see how things go. And then next week, for those of you who are listening, Jonathan Rumi has arrived in Rome safe and sound. So he will be meeting Pope Francis next week. Jonathan Rumi being the actor who plays Jesus in the Chosen series. So that's some news from Rome. Also, we know more statements from the bishops in the last few weeks out of this motu proprio seem to suggest that the motu proprio itself has not been well received by most bishops. The bishops are doing a lot of dispensation for the traditional Latin Mass, so it does seem like there is a sense that the bishops see this law as something that can be dispensed of, and so we are seeing a lot of bishops now stepping up to the plate, saying we need to read more into this and how we're going to apply this, and it does seem also that there are reports that a lot of this motu proprio was inspired by, again, the Italian bishops, some Italian bishops who really wanted to push something like this through. More on that later. And then finally, out of the Archdiocese of New York, this morning or last night, there was a memo that was circulating, Matt, and this is what I find very interesting. A memo was being circulated by the Chancellor of the Archdiocese of New York, who was a politician before he became Chancellor of the Archdiocese of New York. But this memo is circulating all throughout social media. I've not yet been able to confirm whether or not it's a legitimate memo. It is on letterhead and it is signed. But I've yet to hear from the Archdiocese of New York on this. But this memo is from this layman ordering all priests of the Diocese of the Archdiocese of New York, telling them they are not allowed to write religious exemptions for the vaccine. So think about it. Like, your kid wants to go to college, right? But the child doesn't want to have the vaccine, and you don't want the child to have the vaccine because there's some issues with, especially young men right now that we've seen coming out of Israel, where there's some heart issues that have developed because of they believe because of some of the vaccine. And so, we still live in a free country, we think, right? And so there is, and you are able to receive a religious exemption for that for universities. And yet now the Archdiocese of New York, through this politician, this layman, is telling all the priests that they're not allowed to do that because it goes against, quote unquote, the Pope, which that's not the case. So, Matt, lots of information coming out of the church this week. What are your thoughts on that memo? Just as a father and as a Catholic.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here really is the crossover and the friction point between where our Christian responsibility lies, and our responsibility to ourselves and our families, and the role of government. I think that the real issue is that we've had an experimental vaccine created under duress. And I'm going to assume that for the better purposes of the argument, that the intent is genuine to save people in the midst of a pandemic. Of course, we can argue the science about how survivable the actual disease is with different variants. But the issue is that the vaccine's experimental. That there are FDA certification processes normally that you go through, and things we go through for medical testing. But we bypassed a lot of those because of the sense of urgency. And so because it's an experimental vaccine, there's a sense of greater choice and caution. And I don't want to get into conspiratorial arguments. However, there are parents out there who are very concerned about the necessity of giving this to young men and women who are in a very, very, very survivable demographic.
Right.
Is it really necessary? And I have to respect their concerns. I'm vaccinated. I have my young men, my sons vaccinated, mainly because it was the right thing to do so they could get into college. However, if you have concerns because you're of a particular type and demographic where you're at greater risk from taking a vaccine than you are the disease, I have to respect that. So this is really the point of discomfiture between those who want to be free to make their own decision about something they shouldn't be forced to inject in themselves.
Right, and I think that's the argument that I think a lot of people are making in Europe as well. And we're gonna, after the break, we're gonna talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening in Europe. But the Holy Father, through the Congregation of the Doctrine, the CDF, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, put out a document last year talking about the necessity of the vaccine. And specifically on the morality of it. And the reason behind the arguments are Thomistic, and they're sound. And the morality of the vaccine really is, for many Catholics, they're afraid that there's a connection to abortion, aborted fetus cells being tested upon, and as well as being within some of the vaccines. Now, this memo that came out said all of the vaccines are approved. That's not actually what was said at the CDF document. What he said is specific to the vaccines that have tested on the MK. I'm trying to remember the number. I think is like 35 something. The strain of cells that have been developed from a fetus that was aborted, I think 60 plus years ago, and how there's a distance between the CDF document says there's a distance between us using a vaccine that was tested was tested on these, and then us actually participating in that evil work of abortion. And I think a lot of people have to understand that over-the-counter drugs also are being tested oftentimes on the same line. So then you have to start arguing: is this or is this not a legitimate thing? And the CDF document made it clear because of the element of the pandemic and the concern that it can be argued as being legitimate. So, when we get back, we're going to talk about some of the protests of this where there is a sense of being forced. And if one does not take, the vaccine, what the result will be. But for those of you who are listening, stay tuned, and we'll get to that after the break. You have joined Intersections with Bree and Matt Dooley. We'll return in a moment.
Can a moral relativist object to God's goodness based on the problem of evil? The answer is no, at least when it comes to moral evil, and here's the reason. You see, moral relativism states no moral truths exist independently of the individual. That's to say, what is right and wrong is relative to what the individual determines. Now, how can a relativist deviation from his own moral standard be considered morally evil when there's nothing to oblige him to follow his moral standard? The answer is it can't. But if no moral evil can exist within the mental framework of moral relativism, well then obviously a relativist complaint about the problem of moral evil is useless. So the relativist either has to give up the complaint about the problem of moral evil to keep relativism, or give up relativism to keep the complaint about the problem of moral evil. The relativist can't have both. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
We all know children have a natural innocence and a sense of wonder. Yet our world is full of distractions that can pull families in the wrong direction. But with the help of God and a church family, your children can grow in the security of faith, hope, and love. Weekly Mass provides that critical faith foundation needed in life. So if your family hasn't been to Mass in a while, we'd like to invite you home. Discover more at CatholicsComeHome.org.
And welcome back to Intersections, Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events with Bree Dail and our new host, Matt Dooley. And in the last hour, we were talking a little bit about some news out of the Vatican and out of the Church in general, including a memo that's been circulating on social media, reportedly out of the Archdiocese of New York. I've not gotten independent verification on that, but we were talking about this memo and how the layman who is the chancellor is telling priests that they are not permitted, they should not be writing letters of exemption for religious exemption on the vaccine. You know, Matt, this week there have been a lot of protests throughout the world this past week. And I was attending one on Saturday in Piazza del Popolo, but at the same time there were pretty large protests in Germany and also in France. And these protests are on what the Italians are calling the Green Pass. Now, this is something that I think Americans are looking at doing as well. And, there's, of course, rumors already circulating that the Biden administration is looking to shut down travel again and start to quarantine again for the Delta variant in, after August, as soon as after August. So, and we're hearing that here too. But this Green Pass is legislation starting on the 6th in Italy. And what this is, Matt, is that the Italian government has said if you are not vaccinated, at least with one vaccine, not the double dose, but if you have started the vaccine, or if you have not been tested for COVID within 48 hours, we're talking the nose swab within the 48 hours, you are not permitted to have, you won't get the app, the vaccine app, the Green Pass app. What that means is that you cannot use any type of gym. You cannot go inside a restaurant to eat. You're not permitted to go attend social events. You are not permitted to go and attend like concerts or go to the theater, or pretty much you're not allowed to do anything unless you have the Green Pass. And there are questions whether or not that's going to be also impacting transit. And in France, it's even more, from what I'm saying, even more draconian, where it is you are not allowed to go into the grocery stores. So, Matt, do you think that something like this could take place? And I'm going to ask Adrian, our producer, in a second to show the video that I produced for Epoch Times. But then I'm going to want to get your thoughts on whether or not something like this could happen in the United States, knowing the American people. And then what your thoughts are on this. But before that, Adrian, if you could show the video, and we'll also have sound for people who are listening on the radio. He's bringing it up. And there is dead air. Okay, so Adrian's working on it right now, and as soon as it pops, I think it's about to do it. As soon as it pops, then you all will be able to hear. But this is the protest in Piazza del Popolo, which is one of the areas where there are a lot of protests and a lot of gatherings of people throughout Rome. And then some information I'll give that to as well. But I think Adrian's having some technical difficulties. So Matt, what are your thoughts on what's going on in Europe? Oh, here we go. He's about to play it, so stand by. So it looks like in the piazza itself, there are Italians who are calling for resistance against this. They're saying no green pass whatsoever. And I met a teacher in the Piazza del Popolo, and she definitely looked like she probably would support the left side of things. But I asked her where her support was, and she said, this isn't a political thing. She said, I've been out of work for a year. I'm a teacher, and they're telling children that they cannot return to school without the vaccine. She's like, this is ridiculous. This isn't a political thing. This is a life, and this is a life thing, and we want to live. So again, in August, people are calling for freedom for this. Matt, what are your thoughts on this situation in Europe? And I'm sure you've seen other videos of coming out of Europe.
Yeah, I think for Europe in general, we're discovering that the natural state of human beings is to seek freedom. That it's not a uniquely American condition, particularly when you've imposed lockdowns for over 18 months, and folks are beginning to see that there are inconsistencies in the science and the frustrations that are brought on by the desperation of economic circumstances, on top of just the need to be able to get outside and do whatever they want to do. It's, for me, the perspective is emboldening, because I recognize it's not just Americans who have concerns about government overreach. I understand what their feelings are here. And so we talk about legitimacy. Governments and church leaders exist in a domain of legitimacy. If you're seen as legitimate, you're able to have greater compliance to the directives. But there's a huge sense of illegitimacy now in terms of an experimental vaccine, and in terms of which demographics are really at greatest threat, and whether or not things like masks and lockdowns actually work. Right. You can point to different competing data streams depending on which country you're talking about or which demographic you're talking about, where the facts don't always play out. And so when you're trying to impose a draconian set of measures, again, on top of folks who've endured it for another year and a half, after you've been granted a little bit more freedom, I certainly understand where the tension's coming from.
Yeah, Matt, the CDC came out with a information in the past week saying that the Delta variant seems to be breaking through the vaccine, and that individuals are receiving are passing on the Delta variant as much as those who have not been vaccinated, which kind of doesn't make sense if a vaccine is supposed to defeat a virus, right? So what we are seeing here is the Delta. As a doctor said to me in the protest the other day, she's an endocrinologist, and she said, vaccines of themselves for viruses, they can defeat the purpose because viruses want to live in the body. And so the virus mutates in order to continue to live. And she said, so the fact that the Delta variant is out and that it is becoming more and more resistant is not a surprise. That's why the body itself becomes resistant to, it's immune. It builds its immunity, not often through vaccines, but through other means. So, with the CDC coming out and saying this, and then with Dr. Fauci kind of going back and forth, and we are seeing also, I interviewed, and it's up with the Epoch Times now, I asked questions and attended a roundtable hosted by the Vatican and the World Medical Association, where the chair of the World Medical Association, Matt, I mean, he's definitely not an unintelligent man, but he he argued and he took issue with my quote unquote tone, which I thought was quite interesting, because I asked why in this roundtable, which is supposed to be a roundtable, is supposed to have all differing types of opinions. It's supposed to follow the scientific method of question and fact. Why only one side of the argument, and which was pro these vaccines, were represented? And he wasn't really able to answer that question, Matt. Instead, he, took issue with the tone. So, but it was interesting because the head of the Pontifical Academy for Life, who was who was co-sponsoring this, Vincenzo Paglia, Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia, he actually promised that the next roundtable would include voices of the other side. So do you think that with the government enforcing these things, I mean, again, I don't quite understand, and you being quite the genius probably does, you probably understand a little bit more, but what is really at the heart of this, Matt, that they're taking these measures, saying if you are vaccinated, you can come in. If you're not vaccinated, you have to stay outside. What exactly? What's the point of segregation in this? If the Delta variant is breaking through both?
That's a really good question. You're asking to speculate to reason.
Right.
One half of me understands that if the belief is that through draconian measures we can very quickly bring this under control and burn it out, then that makes sense. If the other school of thought is that once total control is felt by those in the levers of power, it's very, very, very difficult to want to let that
take
go.
It away. Right.
If you're looking to maintain your authority, if you're looking to set the conditions for an upcoming election, surely the temptation exists, again, speculating to reason, to lock down and justify some of the things you did 18 months ago or a year ago.
Right.
So I'm sure the temptation must be great to want to dictate to your populace how you're going to address the problem. But like I said earlier, the natural human condition is freedom, and representative democracy should remember that. But the governments exist by fiat and mandate of the people. They serve the people, not the other way around.
Right, and
so
that's the United States too, right? So it's interesting to see that the difference here. Do you think that something like a vaccine passport? Is this in the works? Have you heard that from? I've not heard from my DC sources that is something that is being pushed by legislation. But have you heard anything on the ground on something like that?
No, not yet. I think the real central argument here lies in the argument we're making for voter ID. Only in America can you have one particular side of the political aisle advocating for vaccine passports and the necessity of it, and everybody should have one in order to do the basic things you need to do in society, but that you can't get an ID or shouldn't have to present an ID to vote. It's the single most important thing as an American as far as your rights.
Right.
So you can't have it both ways. In the end, if it's going to be necessary to have some sort of clearance so that you can just engage in your normal life processes, then we should be able to impose the exact same restrictions for other things like voting.
Right.
So I think that's really what's driving the train over here on this side of the pond. You can't get caught out in the open advocating one thing for a stream of logic and then advocating the exact opposite.
You know, that's so funny that you say that, because in Europe, the Europeans have looked at these questions on voter identification, and they're like, what, you don't have that? In the United States, because you have to show your identification, and they do not permit those who are not part of citizens of their country to vote in their elections. They think that's bizarre. So I think you're touching on a nerve there that I think would be an argument to be made on in the United States, but in Europe, there's definitely pushing for other reasons behind this, and it doesn't seem quite legitimate factually or medically now that the CDC's come out with this. But Talk about, we're going to switch a little bit, talk about some draconian measures. Have you been seeing the protests out of Iran in the last week? What, this is an area of expertise that you know the Middle East pretty well. What are your thoughts? Because I'm attempting to interview an Iranian American journalist who has been put on the hit list by the Iranians. Actually, the FBI have been keeping her safe right now because she is on the list to be kidnapped and brought back to Iran. We know that they do that. But are we seeing a reemergence of what was known as the Green Party or the uprisings for freedom in Iran? And what are your assessments on this?
Yeah, I go back to my original quote: "The natural state of human beings is pursuit of freedom." To understand Iran, you've got to be old enough to remember what it was like pre-1979. Iran was once an ally of the United States, very cosmopolitan. They see themselves culturally as Persians first,
yes,
and then everything else second. And so those who are in charge now, the clerics and the folks who are the radicals, who've enjoyed 40 years of total control and dominance, have to be able to produce like any other government. And so when you put the strains of economic issues, COVID, which impacted them as well,
yes, it did.
the normal strains of just being a country in that region, working hard to be a regional dominant power, there are all kinds of things pulling at that population and the relationship with their government. And we're starting to see that in other places like Cuba. People are just sick and tired of being sick and tired. The question is now, what do we do? The last time you had the Green Revolution, when they got close to a reset in Iranian affairs, we stayed out of it. If it approaches that same sort of culmination point, what do we do next?
Yeah, Biden was VP when that happened, and now he's president. Right. And before you go further, something just kind of came to my mind. I'm surprised that this did not take place under the Trump administration. Because we know that the Trump administration would likely have been more apt to engage in the international politicking side of this, as they did with, say, Hong Kong. Even now we have former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo really speaking out strongly against Hong Kong and against the draconian measures. We're going to be talking about China in a second, but draconian measures of the Chinese. He was very strong in doing that on the national and international stage when he was holding that position. So I would have, I don't think it would take much in the way of, just reason to suggest that he would have done the same, and President Trump would have done the same in the way of politics. I'm not sure. Trump was never really interventionist when it came to the military side of things. He was trying to get our people out, but he did believe in engaging and sitting at the table, and he did very well. So do you think, why do you think it's now and not then?
I think the biggest thing governing our relationship with Iran in the previous administration were the concerns over the quote-unquote nuclear deal. I think everyone listening to this would say, I hate to speak to the entire population of the world, but most of us don't want to see a nuclear-armed Iran.
Right.
And so what's the best means of preventing that? Is it reaching out and empowering the Iranian people and encouraging them to join us in the 21st century as a civilized nation at the table with everyone else? Or is the future of Iran someone driven by a 7th century understanding, but equipped with nuclear warheads? There clearly is an argument to be made about containing that for as long as you can and creating, if there's going to be an agreement that works. The previous agreement, without getting into the debate about how we handle it, was not conducive to a permanent restriction. It was a pathway to a nuclear weapon just later. Right. So if we were just buying time, we're not really resolving the problem. And that's really, I think, the center of gravity of the issue now. It wouldn't be such a big deal if the clerics weren't in charge. So how do we set the conditions? I hate to use the term regime change, but that's what it is. How do we empower the Iranians to determine their own future that the vast majority of them truly want. It doesn't look anything like what it is now.
Yeah, and it isn't that's something that I think is really important for a lot of people to understand from two of us who are both experts in, international policy, is that, at the beginning, for those of you who don't know, Matt and I both served during Operation Enduring Freedom, and Matt served in Iraq and Afghanistan during Iraqi freedom. And I think what's really important for people to understand is that one of the lessons learned, I think, that we both can say, like, we knew probably beforehand, because I knew, how the Middle Eastern cultures work, but very patriarchal in its essence. Like, but you take a look at countries that work, and you look at Jordan, for example, that like actually work in the Middle East, that like are working. You can't impose democracy. Like you can't like say, oh, America is exceptional and we want you to be exceptional too, so we're going to make sure that you are exceptional by us imposing our form of governance. Where that didn't happen in the United States. We're exceptional because our founding fathers got to choose how we were going to be governed. So Matt, knowing the background behind in the Middle East, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that are happening over there in a moment, but what are your predictions? Do you think that the Iranians want a form of democracy? That's the first question. And secondly, do you think that with the draconian measures that have been going on, and for those people who don't know, the Iranians have always executed their own people. But we've seen a rise of this, and a rise of imprisonments and protests from families of those who've been imprisoned unjustly and executed, young men and women who have been calling for more freedoms, including like losing the hijab for women. They want to be able to have the freedom, be able to choose whether or not they wear it or not, instead of being enforced. So do you think that there is going to be an uprising, and what are your predictions on that?
Well, I think you're going to see continued tension. Ultimately, I think what you're looking at is an Iranian people trying to figure out how to create a government, a system of a society that's accountable to them. Is it going to be Jeffersonian democracy, as you say? I would say no, and right. It's wrong for us to expect that. Right. But is it going to be something a bit more responsive and a bit more accountable to the Iranian people? I think so. That's what they want. Right. How did they get it? That's the real question. Most revolutions do not occur without violence. Right. And in that region of the world, the outcome of resolutions and regime changes usually don't result in anything that isn't first led by a strong man. Whether you're talking about the Shah of Iran or Saddam Hussein or some other dictatorial leader. It's just that region in the world, that's the natural progression step. Yes. So I would not expect to see something that transitions into what happened at the end of our revolution. We moved through the Articles of Confederation, and there's Madison and Jefferson, and everybody figuring out what eventually becomes our federal constitution. And it's a process that worked for us, and it involved some different Judeo-Christian ethos. Right. I would certainly hope it isn't something like what occurred in 1789 to 1792 and all that with France. That was 10 years of the guillotine.
Blood.
So I hope that this transition, though will be full of turmoil, won't be a bloodbath. However, I'm not optimistic.
I'm not either. And I think also, Matt, if you take a look at, there's only so much people will take. There have been sanctions, there has been the COVID, there has been, the disappearance of people who are fighting against this aging regime. And then, we're seeing this movement of younger people saying, we want freedoms, we want to be able to have prosperity, we want. And it's only a matter of time. But I find it interesting, Matt, and we're going to push a little bit towards this before, and hopefully if we don't get to it, we'll get to the next break and speak about this. But it's interesting to see this turn, right, in Iran, while we're seeing a return in Iraq into Afghanistan to the Taliban, and we're seeing more draconian measures in Turkey. Turkey having been, unitive at one point towards, a secular political sphere, and now has gone back towards extremism to the point where there are questions. I myself am also asking this question: why are they in NATO? They have violated a few elements of NATO that should have allowed them, should have gotten them kicked out under, the Trump administration. But with the Taliban, it's not surprising to me. Is it surprising to you that the Taliban have come back into power in Afghanistan?
No, they're actually two different things. We're talking about Afghan politics or Afghan history versus what's going on in Turkey.
Right.
I'll address each of them in turn. What's going on in Turkey, in my opinion, with Erdogan consolidating power is an echo return of the Arab Spring. And so we talk about Sunni Islam versus Shia Islam. Erdogan saw himself as more of a Sunni unifier, and discussions of him leading the next caliphate.
New Ottoman, yeah.
That was the end. At the end of the Ottoman Empire in the early 1920s, the collapse. That was the last quote unquote legitimate caliphate. So that's what drives his thinking, and it's different than the role that Turkey played as a NATO partner for decades.
Yes.
And so the question remains: does that energy continue with the demise of ISIS in Syria and the end of the turmoil across the Middle East that resulted with the outcome of Al-Qaeda and the Arab Spring? That remains to be seen.
Matt, we're coming up to a break. We're coming up to a break, and I definitely want to talk about the Taliban in Afghanistan, but I think there's a point to be made there that people need to keep their eye on Turkey for multiple reasons. But one of the areas that I'm very concerned about is in the last few years, the attacks on a Christian minority group that have had to deal with attacks from the Ottomans before, back in 1914, 15, 16, the Yazidis.
That's a repeat we don't want.
Yeah, the Yazidis had to actually take care of the Christian minorities there. And we saw what happened with the genocide, the Armenian genocide, where women and children were crucified for their faith. We don't want to see that. But when we return, we're gonna hit what's going on in Afghanistan, because people really need to know what's happening and why the Chinese are involved. So stay tuned. Come back to us after the break. This is Intersections with Bree Dail and Colonel Matt Dooley. We thank you for joining us.
Are Christians guilty of hate speech for voicing their belief that homosexual acts are immoral and contrary to human nature? Many in the culture think so. So what can we say in response? First, it's not hate speech to say a particular behavior is inappropriate human behavior given our nature as human beings. If that were true, well then any negative moral evaluation of behavior would be hate speech. But that's absurd. Second, the assertion is inconsistent with itself. Why can't Christians have a negative moral evaluation of homosexual behavior, but yet the objector can negatively judge a Christian's behavior for opposing homosexuality? Isn't he guilty of the very thing he accuses Christians of? My friends, it's not hate speech to say a particular behavior is not befitting of human beings. We must judge actions, but always with respect for the person. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
Years ago, when I started acting, modeling, and singing in Mexico, my Catholic faith was not the center of my life. It took me many years to discover that success, fame, money, and all the pleasures of the world were not going to fulfill me. I got to a point in my life where I thought I had everything, but I realized something was missing. Thankfully, I began a faith journey that brought me back to God and home to the Catholic Church. You can too.
Discover more at CatholicsComeHome.com.
And and welcome back to the all-new Intersections with Bree and Matt. I'm your host, Bree Dail. I'm joined by Colonel Matthew Dooley, United States Army, and I am so excited about this show because I think a lot of people are going to start to dive into more of what's going on in current events, and we are going to hope to bring others on to listen to what you are saying, and we'd love to have call-ins in the future. But I want to give a shout out to Colin. Thank you, Colin, for sending a lot of the comments that you have today, and I'm going to share with Matt as well. But yes, it is a privilege to be able to serve in our great U.S. military, and it is becoming harder for a lot of people now because things are getting woke in our military. So Matt and I are also happy to no longer be serving in that role, and so that we can come and speak to what's going on in politics and current events. It's actually a privilege to be able to do that after having served and gained the expertise that we have. But so Matt, we're going to talk a little bit about the Taliban. So you served in Afghanistan. You know the situation pretty well over there and the history behind Afghanistan and the many different countries who've tried to rule there or impose some form of governance there. So if we can do a little bottom line up front, like a little bluff on the history behind there, and then who is coming in to play now with the Taliban this week, which made some headlines.
Yeah, one small point of correction. I did a lot of analysis for Afghanistan, but never actually served on the ground there. All of my time, for all of my deployments, all over the place, including 2 trips to Iraq, there on the ground, and my operations in the Middle East. I did not get a chance to go to Afghanistan. However, I'm very familiar with conditions there because of being on corps level staff and multinational headquarters. You can't, for the last 20 years, can't help but deal with it. However. That being said, understanding that region of the world, you've got to go all the way back to Alexander the Great. There's a reason why they call it the graveyard of empires. Yes. To understand the terrain, it's very tribal. If you can imagine a country where you've got a higher piece of terrain, a big rock in the center of it, and then everyone lives on the periphery, you've got to understand what drives economics, what drives politics there is very different than any other region in the world. It's a crossing point. And it has failed for a number of different nations or groups who've gone there and tried to do what they needed to do since or what they wanted to do since Alexander the Great. Whether you're talking about the British or the Russians or our efforts at nation building, and now soon to be the Chinese.
Yes.
To understand how decisions are made there, you have to look at the basic family structure, the tribal structure. You have to understand how they look at the world, and it's not something you can impose your definitions of rational actor upon. What we have to understand is that we may have all the watches, but they have the time. So going in there with a set of managed expectations is the best thing you can do. I don't think the United States went in there initially to do nation building. No. We went in there to punish, justifiably so, those who were responsible for 9/11. Right. And we made our meaning plain to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and then set about trying to set the conditions for a different Afghanistan model.
Why do you think that was? Like there's an argument, and I think that comes from the Truman Doctrine, that once there is a war that the United States has engaged in, the best way of being able to prevent future war will be to create a new generation of people who appreciate the United States, who want to work with the United States. And it's not a wrong thought, I guess, in Western nations where that took place, and also in Japan where that took place. But in a place, like you said, in Afghanistan, where they have all the time in the world and they're not interested in our ideology. They have their culture, and that's what they want. They want to be left alone. It's one of the reasons why bin Laden was successful in hiding out for so long. I
agree with you. Looking at the differences, why does the Truman Doctrine, or why did it work in Japan and Germany and Western Europe and not work in other places. And I would submit to you that there are important cultural differences between each of the
Yes.
locations, that it's not a generic template. Also, you're looking at the end of World War II. You're looking at two peoples who were conquered conclusively. They understood, whether it was Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany, they understood at the end that they were completely conquered. And the willingness to go in there and set the rules and enforce the rules, and then follow it up with a Marshall Plan with investment. There are huge differences between how we concluded World War II and what we've done since in nation building and what you called it the Truman Doctrine. Was that our intent with Afghanistan? Were we even capable of doing that with a culture set as they are? Looking back on it, having the benefit of hindsight, yeah, absolutely not.
No. And now what we see is
what are we
that
seeing?
the Chinese are now making their way. The Chinese have just met with the Taliban leaders this past week. When I saw the video and the photos, I was just not at all surprised. This is how the Chinese work. They go into Africa and they use all of the material, raw material, and they give money to the corrupt, and they don't care. They're so utilitarian. The essence of looking at these people, it just doesn't exist. So, what are your thoughts about the Chinese now dealing with the Afghanis? And do you think that they're going to be played as well? I mean, in my thought process, I have my own opinions on this, but I'd love to get your analysis.
Well, I understand why the Chinese are going in there. That's the Belt and Road Initiative is what it's called.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's their policy, their plan to cede their influence and control over access and resources throughout the world. However, Afghanistan isn't Africa. Afghanistan isn't a Caribbean island. Afghanistan is tribal. So they're going in there looking for rare earth minerals. And there are significant deposits of a number of different things, including lithium, which we all have to have for our batteries, for our smartphones, and our cars, and a whole host of thousands of other technologies. So there's a reason economically why they want to be there. But they're going to run into the same things that everyone else has gone on to Afghanistan, is that if you can't learn to work with the tribes, if you can't learn to accept their level of what we would call corruption, and then you react in a heavy-handed fashion, you will see the same response
Right.
the Soviets experienced, that we saw, and that they will see. My personal belief is that they'll run afoul of it. They'll react brutally. There'll be a
Yes.
response against that, and ultimately they'll have to withdraw as well, because the cost that it will take them to stay there simply will not be worth it. It may take
I think there's
longer.
something that we have to look at too of what's gone on in the last year in on the border between China and India and some of these really remote, very high altitude places, and where there's a lot of tribalism that takes place up there. And the Chinese have tried to react brutally, but they've been pushed back because they don't have the resources. You know, it's one of the things that you, as a military historian, can look at and say, you know, if you take a look at the Civil War, one of the main reasons why the South lost was, well, they didn't have as many soldiers, but it was also because they were cut off. And they cut themselves off from resources. You don't want to lose your resourcing from from the main military group, because your soldiers are gonna starve. They're not gonna have the resources to be able to fight a battle, and we've seen that happen multiple times. We've seen it under Napoleon. We've seen it, with many emperors, and we've seen it now with the Chinese. You cannot fight a war in that way. But the thing that causes me concern is that the Chinese, because they're so utilitarian, they don't care. They will bring money and try to throw money at the solution until they can manipulate. And another concern that I have is that they are brutal in the way that they handle the humanitarian elements. But like you said, the USSR did the same thing, and they were kicked out. Any last thoughts as we end? We close towards the ending of the show on what's going on in China with the Taliban?
Yeah, I think the question will be power projection. Can the Chinese military project power, both in terms of getting there, keeping them resupplied and staying, if it turns into a fight? We've seen other examples where those wars didn't last very long along their borders, whether it's the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War or their conflicts with India. The Chinese military has not really been good with power projection historically. So can they do that? The vast majority of their large military is inwardly focused, and that's, I think, a fact that's lost on a lot of folks looking at the situation. Is that yes, they do have a large military, but a lot of that's projected inward to maintain control for the Communist Party. How much can they afford to throw outside their borders for a sustained campaign remains to be seen.
I think that that's a really, really good point for people to understand too, that the Chinese are suffering right now from what looks to have been floods last year in the region which grows their food, and so they've had to put measures down already for food consumption, and that also impacts the military as well. So as we close, I want people to keep an eye on, those of you who are listening, keep an eye on what's going on outside the world in general, looking at not only the protests that we've been talking about on the Green Pass and the vaccine and whatnot, but also in these movements of the different power struggles in the world. Because usually when there's crisis, there are crisis manipulators, and so I want to thank you, Matt, for joining the show. I'm super excited for us to be doing this. If you liked our show, please comment below, share this out, get the word out that Power and Patriots is back with the Intersections, Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events, and hopefully we'll get Buzz Patterson on here and other guests. But for now, we thank you for joining us, and we sign off and take care.